This is Ken Buckler with Radio Free Hub City, and I'd like to welcome you to today's episode, What the is a Podcast? So what is a podcast? So think of podcasts as basically talk radio, but on demand. A lot of talk radio programs actually follow the same format as a typical podcast does. Probably some of the most popular, well-known talk radio shows that really are in podcast format. Great example, probably going to be Howard Stern. He's probably one of the most famous talk radio hosts of all time. Him and Imus in the morning, and there's several big greats out there. Of course, Rush Limbaugh, probably the biggest one out there. So think of podcasts as being a way for really anyone to talk about anything, talk about any topic. So this podcast that you're listening to right now is actually dedicated to talking about podcasts, talking about what does it take to make a podcast, what kind of podcasts are out there, why you would probably want to make a podcast, and how making a podcast can probably benefit you or your business, or of course both. So once again, this is Ken Buckler, Radio Free Hub City. I'm actually the founder of Radio Free Hub City, and it's a small internet radio station. Actually been running for a month now, and I was only expecting like 5 listeners or something by this time. We're already up to over 100 listeners now, and I'm absolutely ecstatic about that. I founded Radio Free Hub City on the basis of I wanted something that's a mix between traditional podcasting and talk radio. So what do I mean by that? So the concept behind Radio Free Hub City is that I set up a schedule block of I'm going to have certain shows playing at certain times. And those shows, I'll play the new ones on the day that they get released. And then after that, you get a random replay of whatever show. So what's interesting about that is I even have in my lineup a random spot where you actually get a random podcast, a random show at that point of all of the shows that we play. So I don't even know what it's going to play. And the beautiful part about that is it introduces you to new podcasts, introduces you to new talk radio, introduces you to new content that you might like, that you might want to start tuning into every day. And as an added bonus then for my station, I also get to create something that's community focused. And something that really gets lost in the global internet, I think, is that local community. So I'm building Radio Free Hub City to bring that local community back while also being able to provide content that would actually be of interest to a global audience. And, I have some fantastic content partners. The content partner that's providing most of my content is Venue Media. They are absolutely fantastic. They have a podcast. They actually started off with a podcast called The Hub Show. And The Hub Show is about anything, everything, and nothing at all. They have different topics each week. They originally started out as just audio only. Then they moved to video. And now I'm helping them get back to their roots with audio. And the way I'm doing that is I'm going to be hosting the Hub Show on Radio Free Hub City every week, every time that it airs. Eventually, we're going to start doing the Hub Show live on Radio Free Hub City as long as we can get the podcasting software to work. And also, I'm going to have several other shows going to be live. Now, this show itself, the Radio Free Hub City podcast, I'm not going to be making it live. I'm not going to record it live because I've got a lot of editing that I need to do on it, and that's okay. Some podcasts, it's okay not to be able to do the podcasts live. One of the things I'm going to do with this podcast is I'm going to have interviews with other people who run podcasts. Some of them will be venue media folks, of course. Some of them will be folks from other podcasts. And I'm really looking forward to talking with people about what they're doing, talking with people about what it's been like to run a podcast, especially the ones that actually have interactive sessions with listeners where you can actually call in. I'm actually setting that up for this podcast. Now, obviously, you won't be able to do live call ins for the entire audience, but I'm setting it up so I can have listeners or guests call in and they're going to be able to interact with me as I record this podcast. So it's looking really fantastic. Uh, what's coming down the pipeline for this podcast? But let's talk a little bit more about podcasts. Where do you get them at? How do you traditionally get a podcast? What's the typical format like? Well, as you can hear in this podcast right now, I have a set topic, I have a set agenda, and the set topic for this podcast is what is a podcast? And the format for this podcast is I'm going to keep this down to about 24 minutes is my target. And there's a reason for that, and I'll get to that here in a little bit. Why I'm making it such a short podcast and not going all the way to like 30 minutes. But let's talk about a little bit about podcasts. So as you can see, it's somebody talking or multiple people talking. I'm hoping to get a co-host on here and get guests on here and actually have some great meaningful conversations. But for this first podcast, I thought it was appropriate that I do this one by myself. So how do you get a podcast? Well, there's a lot of software out there that you can actually use to find podcasts and then download them and listen to them on demand. These are called podcast clients, obviously. And some of them you probably know, like for example, Spotify. There's other ones out there as well. And they're also known as media aggregators. They're actually designed to automatically access the online file or the feed, download the audio file, or sometimes even a video file, and put it on your smartphone, put it on your iPod, so that you can listen to it later. And there's hundreds of these out there. And there's little small ones that people like that are probably like fancy features or just completely bare bones. And then there's bigger ones such as Spotify. And what one doesn't matter if you use, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter what program you use. The big thing is that you need some sort of the software to find all of these podcasts. The other option is, and a lot of podcasts do this, is you go onto their website and you pick the podcast on demand. A lot of times with that, for example, SoundCloud is a pretty popular host for that. There's also ones that are out there specifically tailored towards podcasts. So, but the programs run on your smartphone, and they actually go out to what's called an RSS file, typically, and that's basically an internet method of creating a feed of this is the latest stuff on this website. Here's where you get it. And the file tells the program on your smartphone about the audio or the video file stored on the server, and the client downloads that file for the user to view or listen to. So then the podcast client, that allows the user to view information on a very wide range of topics from their smartphone, or just even through a web browser. And just like blogs, it allows people to find writers, to find podcasters that are in a niche that is a topic that they enjoy. So, for example, this niche that I'm in here right now is for people who want to start a podcast, or people who are a marketer who are evaluating, is a podcast right for my organization. And I'm going to tell you right now, 9 times out of 10, the answer is probably yes. Yes, it is. But of course, there's also a lot of competition among podcasts. But most of the time, it's free to publish the podcasts, and it gets people interested in some unique content. Podcasts allow people to find this audio or video, and instead of listening, or I'm sorry, instead of browsing different websites, they're just listening to it in their ears while they're doing something else. So they can listen to it while they're working or something like that. So think of it as if thousands of radio and television channels were created to serve every possible interest, and then more were even made every day. Using the podcast client to access and download those audio files or video files, that allows you to keep up with the podcast sites as it's published to the podcast feeds. So I really hope that that makes sense. Like I said, it's absolutely fantastic. Some of the podcasts that I've listened to. Right now I'm listening to a metal detecting podcast, and those folks are fantastic. You don't think of metal detecting as, hey, how do you do a metal detecting podcast? Well, you talk about techniques for using equipment. You talk about different equipment that's out there. You talk about revisiting old metal detecting sites and new techniques to search those old sites. So let's dive a little bit deeper here into the types of podcasts that are out there, and we'll explore this a little bit further. So stay tuned. So what are the types of podcasts out there? Well, it's important to differentiate between podcast topics and podcast formats. Now, podcast topics, there's every podcast topic out there imaginable probably exists. So, as I mentioned previously, there's a metal detecting podcast I listen to. You can listen to news podcasts. You can listen to podcasts about sewing, podcasts about knitting, painting, photography, sports, wrestling. You name it, it's probably out there. But a lot of these podcasts have different formats. So the first format is really an interview podcast, and that's where you bring someone on who you're going to talk with. You want to find out information about this person, information about their business, information about their industry, and you bring them onto this podcast so that you can interview them, just like if it was a news interview. The second one is a conversational podcast. Now, this is a little bit more casual, still similar to an interview podcast, although sometimes it's just going to be co-hosts talking the entire time. And the conversational podcasts, like I said, they're a little more laid back, they're a little more relaxed, a little more of a conversation than an interview, and it's really just going to be very smooth, very easygoing content. The third one is actually what you're listening to right now, and that's a monologue podcast. Monologue podcast. It's a single host, just speaks the entire episode, and that's what I'm doing now. I don't have any co-hosts. I don't have any guests, and audience members just tune in and you listen, and you uh, then can provide feedback through comments or contact the host, email the host, and you can also think of monologue podcasts as can kind of be like training sessions. And that's really important because you could theoretically use a monologue podcast format if you want to teach something. If you want to teach someone how to do something. For example, how do you take photos? Now, it's hard to relay how to take a photo without visuals. So in that case, you would actually want to do video as well for part of your podcast. But you could do a podcast on how to play the piano, a podcast on how to be a DJ, and anything you can think of, you can probably do a podcast on as a monologue podcast. Another one that's interesting is a storytelling or investigative podcast. Now, this would actually be, how I'm going to tell you a story about something that recently happened. So, for example, I actually I have a show called History Hub Hunters, and I'm going to tell you a story of that show of how we found X artifact. We metal detected through these woods, and then finally, after 4 grueling hours, we finally found George Washington's spear camp. Yes, that's right, folks. And then another one is Roundtable Podcast. Now, that's kind of like a conversational podcast, except you're typically going to have a main host who's going to be the actual host, and then you're going to have co-hosts who are going to be the panelists. And basically the main host will provide a discussion topic, and the panelists then discuss. Another topic, another podcast format, is a theatrical podcast. Theatrical podcasts can really be dramatized. Think of it as you have a theater production, but it's only audio. Great example there is going to be all of the old time radio shows. So there's old radio shows. Probably one of the more famous ones is going to be The Shadow, or Dick Tracy. And those were audio shows that were played over the radio on a weekly basis. And you actually had voice actors come in and portray those shows. Another one is, this is an interesting one. It's repurposed content podcasts. This one's interesting because you can, take backlogs of content. For example, let's say you've got old episodes of, local sports or something like that, and you can take those old episodes that was a video recording or something like that, and you play clips of those episodes, clips of those video recordings of a sports event that was local to you. Don't do that with a national event, because that's probably going to be copyright infringement. But if it's something that you actually have the copyrights to, repurpose that and do a play-by-play and talk about, oh, hey, okay, so here's where this player made an amazing move. Here's why it was so amazing. Or, oh, this is where this player could have done something better. Here's what they could have done instead, and it probably would have changed the course of the game. And then another one is, of course, hybrid podcasts. Hybrid podcasts are basically all of the previous podcasts that I just mentioned, all put together. You could even have in there, as part of a hybrid podcast, actually throw in music. You can actually have entire podcasts, which are really a radio show where you're going to have some speaking about the music that's getting played, and then you play the music. Probably one of my favorites on this is there's a show that's real late at night on our local radio called House of Hair, and that's actually a syndicated program for hair rock bands, and that's fantastic. I absolutely love that old stuff. So I hope this is all a real good overview of what kind of podcast formats you can do. Please feel free to reach out to me. You have any questions, and you can reach me through radiofreehubcity.com, and I am happy to discuss with you how these podcasts work in a little more detail. With that said, stay tuned for the next episode, because my next episode, we're actually going to talk about picking a topic, picking your format, and actually starting a podcast. What do you need to start one? So stay tuned for next week's episode, and I'll see you soon.
The Radio Free Hub City podcast is copyright 2021 Red Mana Properties, LLC. All rights reserved. Reproduction, redistribution, or retransmission, without written permission, is strictly prohibited. Visit us on the web at radiofreehubcity.com, and don't forget to like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter.